I'm joining this session from the Gumbaynggirr Nation, which is on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And I know everyone's on many different places. My name's Lisa Milner. I'm one of the committee members of interventions, and I'm very proud to be topping and tailing and doing some admin for this event. I'm very excited to have in my hands an actual copy of Wayne Murdoch's book, The Mystery of the Handsome Man. We're going to be talking about the book. We're going to be hearing from 3 different people about the book, including Wayne, of course. And we have got some time for this event, for questions at the end. The most important details to start with is about buying the book. If you buy the book in the next 48 hours from NIBS, which is the new international bookshop running out of virtually a Melbourne place, it's a cheap $30, including postage. Usually it's $35. We'll be putting the link of the details in the chat box. You know, because of lockdown, postage to getting to you and working from home may make the book a little slow in getting to you, but we know it's going to be there. I'm really, really proud to be assisting in this launch today. It's the first time I've actually met Wayne face to face. But what I am going to do now is to hand to my colleague, my partner in crime in interventions, Graham Willett. Thanks, Graham. Now, where's Graham gone? Has Graham left the Zoom room, has he? Just as I'm introducing him. Okay, that's very interesting. I hope he appears soon. Let me go looking for him.
Lisa, while you're looking for him, I just want to say a big congratulations to you and Graham for interventions. I mean, I just know as a writer, it was many moons ago that I started out as a writer, but we really need more publishers, and we need more publishers in this country that take risks with the kind of work that they're doing. So I'm just over the moon about what you're doing. And it also, I mean, you know, Wayne, I've already said to you, congratulations. I think this is a splendid book. And it also looks beautiful. I like it.
Does.
So,
it does.
Yeah, so yeah, big love to all of you for the...
Oh, look, thanks so much for those kind words, Christos. And while we're waiting for Graham to magically reappear, yeah, Interventions is an organisation I've been very proud to be a member of the committee for a couple of years now. It's been going since 2015, and Interventions is specifically designed to publish books that wouldn't ordinarily get published because of their content, either in terms of their political or any other sorts of ways that they might be rejected or opposed by mainstream press. We've been very lucky even in the lockdown of the last 2 years to have published, I believe, 6 books, which we're very proud of. We've got many more coming up. And so that's really something that I'm happy to be associated with. Now, I do understand that Graham's back in the room somewhere. So if I can throw to him with Maddie's help, that would be fantastic.
Sorry.
There you are.
There I am. Where else would I be?
That's all right. Lovely to have you with us.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. Well, for being there, really. We're really excited to be able to have this event. I was saying before, we got Wayne's book launched in Bendigo, where some of the action in it takes place. Fondly imagining that we'll be able to do Melbourne again quite soon. That turned out to be less than true. And while on the one hand, it does mean we don't get to stand around having drinks and, you know, nibbles, we do get to all be here, and that's sometimes easier to do it by Zoom. We're really pleased to have Christos and Wayne with us. As Lisa was saying, the Queer Oz Folk has been established in order to publish affordable, readable, good quality Australian queer history. And starting off with Wayne's book was a great thing to do. The next one will be Sylvia Martin's Passionate Friends, which some people might remember from the year 2000, but, you know, long out of print and deserving to be seen. So my job is really to interview Wayne and Christos, who are then going to be in conversation. Wayne is the author of an earlier book called Camp Melbourne in the 1920s and 30s, Trade, Queens and Inverts, which was sort of one of the inspirations. It's a terrific book, but the publishers have that kind of model of charging a lot and selling it to libraries. And so one of the reasons, one of the criteria for this project is affordability. So we're very pleased to be able to sell this book tonight online, thanks to the New International Bookshop. Normally $35, tonight as the usual sort of launch discount at $30. Wayne did his PhD many years ago, which was the basis of Camp Melbourne. It's currently, I'm told, and now I'm about to tell everyone else, so it must be true, working on a longer history of queer Melbourne, going back at least to the start of colonisation. Christos is actually one of those people that needs no introduction, and yet you kind of feel obliged to do it. The secret is to slow it down, to kind of reduce it to something manageable. The word often used, the adjective often used is acclaimed, and he's a Melbourne-based author of 6 novels, including Loaded, which I think was the first one, which was the feature film Head On. And both the book and the film are terrific. They're really stood, I reread Loaded recently, really stood the test of time. And that whole series of other ones, The Jesus Man, Dead Europe, Damascus, which was really gripping in a kind of horrifying sort of way, which I really liked. Playwright, essayist, screenwriter, currently with Clem Bastow and Casey Benetto. He co-hosts Superfluity on Tuesday nights on Community Radio 3RRR. It's in fact the radiothon for 3RRR. So after you've spent all your money on us, you could go on and spend a bit more contributing to one of the really important community-based organisations. He's also patron for Writers Victoria. At which point I think we're going to hand it over to Christos and Wayne.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thanks for a really generous introduction. While you were offline, I said what a splendid book I think The Mystery of a Handsome Man is, and I want to congratulate you guys in Interventions Press and Wayne, you for writing it. It has an absolutely terrific opening, that opening chapter. So we're in September 1897 on the corner of Grattan Street and Leicester Street in Carlton. And if we were actually in the physical space of the New International Bookshop, it would be a 10-15 minute walk, and we could go up there. And John Lempriere, am I saying that right? Lempriere?
Yes, yeah. Lempriere.
John Lempriere Irvine walks up to a 19-year-old working class lad called Ernest Smith and asks, "Hello, are you working?" The implication being, can I pay you to have sex? It's a confronting, stunning opening, and a sense of Irvine being a really confident man. How was that always from the beginning? Did you have a sense of that's where you were going to start? And who is the Irvine that you found in your research? And tell us a bit about, yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks, Christos. When I discovered Irvine quite by accident, doing Trove research, thank God for Trove. I was just dipping into Trove, looking for 19th century queer stories, and I was using search terms that might bring up these sorts of stories. So things like disgusting practices and dreadful disgusting doings, etc., etc. And I actually stumbled across a case of this man who had actually been set upon and attacked by a gang of larrikins who, in the 1880s were not nice. That didn't have a light-hearted connotation. He'd been attacked by this gang of street youths who robbed him and threatened to go to the police if he and accuse him of doing, of making an unnatural advance to them if he actually complained about the robbery to the police. I thought, well, that's an interesting story. It's an interesting MO that the youths have got. The man was went to court, but was actually no case was brought to bear. And I actually, because his name was mentioned, John Lempriere Irvine, I thought, well, that's interesting. What else can I find about him? So I very quickly found this 1897 case, so 11 years later, of Irvine walking up to Ernest Smith on the corner of Leicester and Grattan Street and saying, "Hello, are you working?" And then it all just fell into place. So when I was actually thinking about writing, as I was doing the research and thinking about actually telling the story, I thought, what's a good place to start? So many biographies start, I recall that I was born, etc. I thought, no, because that's going to take too long to get into the really meaty part of the story. What's the best way of doing this? So I thought, well, why don't I start somewhere towards the end and backtrack from there? And it's just that 1897 case, considering what had happened previously, was just such a pivotal moment in the story because it was basically the culmination of everything that had come before, but also the tipping point for what happened after. And so I thought, that is where I want to start telling the story. And it is, it's a really great opening scene to actually fit someone's life around. And it does actually show Irvine as a very, as you say, confident man. There's not a lot of records of 19th century male prostitution in Melbourne. It's never mentioned in the press. There's it's uncharted territory, and you might think that it didn't exist. But here is a man who obviously was used to actually using rent boys and was confident enough to go up to someone in the street, assuming they were trade, and make that comment. So he's also, he's emblematic of a subculture that's very hidden in Melbourne in the 1890s.
One of the things, and we've talked about this together, that is fascinating for me about the book is, and talking about those hidden subcultures, is the prominence of class, right? So Irvine is a banker. He works for a bank. He comes from a settler family, a non-convict family in white Australia. He is a man of renown. He's an upright bourgeois man, right? And then you have the larrikins, these working class youth. And it was such a shock to me, and you describe it really well. I've grown up with the idea of the larrikin being something of a word of pride, that's something that defines a working class Australian culture. And it was a shock in reading your book to think, oh, no, it had a really different meaning, had a really dangerous meaning. Now, so it seems, so to give the people listening a sense of how segregated this world is in terms of class, right, as well as a whole heap of other areas, of course, in terms of colonial gendered differences. But in terms of class, Irvine was this champion rower, right? But even rowing was divided by class. The working class men could not compete with the bourgeois men. So how do you think, do you feel like it was actually in this sexual play that the classes could actually meet at that time in the late 19th century?
Yes, very much so. Class is so important in the 19th century. And even though Australia saw itself as being a classless society, that's not the case. In the 19th century, class permeates everything. Your opportunities in life, your educational opportunities, where you live, what you do, the jobs that are open to you, the attitudes that you hold. And so one of the few ways that a middle-class man could interact on a semi-equal, and there are, you could say otherwise, but on a semi-equal basis was in this sexual world. Although, of course, it's a world where the middle-class man is offering the working class youth money for services. So it is a very unequal world in many ways, but it's one of the very few places where those two worlds actually come together in some way, because otherwise they just wouldn't. We were talking a couple of days ago about whether it would have been possible for two men of different classes to actually maintain a relationship, and the answer would be no. The class boundaries were so strict that society couldn't comprehend why a middle class man would be friends with a working class man. And so the only way a relationship could actually be maintained is if they actually carried out those unequal roles, class roles in their private life. So master and servant would be a perfect cover for a relationship, but not an equal relationship. So yeah, this sexual world, this demi-monde sexual world is one of the very few places where these worlds actually interact and intersect.
Oh, I'm going to ask you about rowing, because another surprise for me in reading the book is I had no idea rowing was such a popular sport. Like, a kind of, you say, I'm paraphrasing, but that it was up there with the fanatic obsession that we had, Australians had with football and with cricket. What did rowing mean for those men?
Rowing, it's interesting that rowing is actually no longer seen as one of the big sports. I mean, in the 19th century, yes, along with football, cricket and horse racing, rowing was the fourth big sport, and crowds of tens of thousands would turn out to watch a regatta or a race. And the races that Irvine competed in were intercolonial championship races between Victorian teams and New South Wales teams. And, they would travel, they would take it in turns. Melbourne and Sydney would take it in turns to host these competitions. And every year, tens of thousands of people would turn out to actually watch these races. Why racing was so important in 19th century, I'm not quite sure, but as I actually say in the book, in the 19th century, most people had some experience of the boats, the water, the sea.
Sure.
So many people had actually come to Australia by ship, or their parents had. The quickest way to get from one coastal capital city to another coastal capital city was by coastal steamer, not by railway or road, obviously. And rowing was, and a lot of people had experience of rowing as a job. So it grew out of things like watermen and ferrymen who would be carting people and goods around the bays of Sydney Harbour, or across the Yarra or up and down the Murray, etc. So it was kind of one of those sports that grew out of occupational interests. But as you say, interestingly, in the 19th century, middle-class bourgeois rowers who did it for pure interest and enjoyment's sake didn't compete with working-class rowers. The competitions were actually held quite separately. And that was actually because it was said that a middle-class man who spends all day working in an office cannot physically compete with a working class man who uses his muscles and strength all day. And so it was seen that the working class would actually have an unfair advantage over the middle class rowers. And so the various teams in Melbourne were actually, particularly in Melbourne, there were various occupationally based teams. So Irvine was a member of the Banks rowing team, which was made up of members of the various banks of Melbourne, very middle class. But the warehousemen had their own team as well. And the two would never compete. The warehousemen would compete with other working class teams. The banks would compete with other middle class teams. And it's a very interesting world.
It is. I mean, as I said, that kind of division was really enlightening to read about. I'm just laughing because as you were talking, one thing my mother always said is, "You writers have such soft hands." The one of the reasons the rowing aspect of Irvine's life fascinated me is that I couldn't help. It was almost like it was a call and response when I was reading The Mystery of the Handsome Man. I kept thinking back to Ian Forster's Morris, which is a novel that I first read when I was in my teenage years, and I reread and keep reading, and it's set a few years later, but only a few years later, and it too has a story about a middle class man, a bourgeois, like a bourgeois man, and there is a kind of a working class love story there. But one thing that fascinated me about your writing of Irvine is that confidence that I talked about right from the beginning, almost the fearlessness. And unlike the Morris in Forster, who is until quite late in the book so repressed, Irvine's, he's a confident man. He's a traditional, in that way, quite a traditional man of his class and his world. He's certainly no emancipatory hero in that way. But he also, and the pressure must have been enormous. He doesn't marry. He doesn't have children. That's the sense that I'm interested in, that you have, researching him so thoroughly, living with him for so many years, as you say in your acknowledgements. What is your sense of his sense of self?
Yes, well, he obviously was a very confident man, and that comes from his background, his establishment family, who knew everybody, and that as I researched his life and his family, I just kept, great granny was a friend of Lachlan Macquarie's, and they just knew everybody. So he comes from that very establishment background. So he's got that sense of self and confidence. He was also a champion sportsman, and we all know even today they think they're bulletproof. So, he's got that sense of confidence. He comes across as a fairly likable person. Someone described him years later as, who's hail fellow well met. And he, every town, because he worked for banks and was transferred. So, Launceston, Melbourne, Ballarat, Bendigo, back to Melbourne, up to Sydney. Every town he went to, he very quickly got involved in local activities. He was obviously involved in the local rowing clubs, but he got involved in cricket, football, church choirs, everything. So he's that very outgoing sort of person. It'd be very interesting to sort of see if you could do a Myers-Briggs on him and see what his personality type was. But he's very outgoing. He's very confident. He makes enemies along the way, because I think anyone who's that confident is going to rub people up the wrong way. But yeah, that was the sense I got from him as I went through. Does that?
Yeah, no, there's a sense in the reading, and I think this works because of the way you start, because you take us into that moment in 1897 and what happens. And he's risking, he's already, 11 years earlier, he's basically been gay bashed, right? Bashed, a term that didn't exist then, but that's what happened to him.
Absolutely.
Because he's a man of renown, because of his class, it's saying that it couldn't possibly be that he was a deviant, a pervert, whatever the language was that they were using at the time. But then to go up to Ernest Smith 11 years later, and so blatantly ask for sex. I'm just fascinated. I mean, maybe there's the fiction writer in me, Wayne, of going, well, is there a sense of wanting to recreate a life? I mean, because what happens? Can I give the ending away, or
Yeah.
Is he disappears? He disappears from history. There's this meticulous research that you do, and then once, because the second event creates this huge scandal, he's gone.
Yeah, that's it.
And the fiction writer in me says there must be an element of desiring that, of escaping the world. Do you think that's possible?
I think very much so. I mean, his life is one of the most meticulously documented ordinary lives. He's not a politician. He's not a member of the aristocracy or royal family or anything. He's a bank manager and a champion rower, but he's a bank manager. And his life for 50 years is so meticulously documented. You can follow him practically week by week through newspapers because of all the activities he was involved in. The family is, because they're an establishment family, is meticulously documented. And for 50 years, you can follow him week by week. And then one day he just disappears. He attends a function with his brothers and their wives in Launceston and walks out the door that afternoon and falls off the face of the earth. And that can only be because he wanted to disappear. Because of, as you say, that second instance in 1897 where everything just fell apart. And it was enemies that he had. It was enemies that he had made that actually conducted a smear campaign that brought him undone eventually.
Yeah, reading those anonymous comments in the newspapers made me realise that there's always been pricks.
Yes.
As commentators. There is a melancholy in that Wayne, realising how difficult it was to live a sexual life as a queer person, if I can use that term, back in that period. And I know there's always a tentativeness, quite rightly, about ascribing our contemporary notions of sexuality and gender and identity to the past, that, you've got to be really careful about how, not to make them a 21st century character. And I think you certainly haven't done that. But the melancholy came from thinking how impossible it was for him to live the life that is the fantasy in Morris, in Forster's in his book. And then there's another part of the melancholy which has made me think, what happened to someone? I'm not saying Ernest Smith was homosexual, but some of those larrikin boys who were. How do you document that working class life in the 19th century? What were the opportunities for those people?
Yeah, it's very difficult to document working class lives. I mean, the four of the 5 or 6, actually, there were 6 youths who actually gay bashed him, to use the term, in 1888, and 4 of them were sent to prison. They received long prison terms. Now, they didn't go to prison because they bashed Irvine. They went to prison because they robbed Irvine. And then they threatened to go to the police and accuse him, essentially to blackmail him. And that was their crime. It was the thought that these working class youths could actually, bash up middle class Melburnians and accuse them of appalling crimes that terrified middle class Melbourne and the judge who sentenced them to sentences of 20 years. But it is difficult. I've actually found it impossible to actually find out what happened to those youths after they served their time. Now, none of them served anything like 20 years. 3 of the 4 were out within 4 or 5 years. One of them actually died in jail, but the other 3 were out. And then they also disappeared. They never fell foul of the law in Victoria again, but you know, they have fairly common names. It's difficult to actually track them in the record. So working class lives are always more difficult to trace than someone like Irvine, than a middle class life. And particularly too, if that working class person didn't marry, didn't have children, leaves no record in things like births, deaths, records, and so forth. And for that reason, I don't know if any of the South Melbourne conspirators of 1888, as they were called, I don't know if any of them married. If you want proof or the evidence that they you know, of their sexuality or their outlook or whatever, we can't tell what their outlook was. What I can say is that they were very aware of the existence of, you know, homosexually inclined men in Melbourne in 1888, because their entire MO was to actually pick up a man outside a pub, and Irvine was picked up outside Young and Jackson's in Flinders Street, pick up a man outside a pub late at night, work out where they were going. The gang lived in South Melbourne. If the man was going towards South Melbourne, they would walk along with him and then get him into a dark alleyway, and then one of them would walk with him. The rest of the gang would follow at a distance, get him into a dark alleyway and jump him and rob him. And they did that at least 3 times within a period of a month in early 1888. And it's possible that there was a 4th attack and more than that. So, you know, so if they've done it once, they could have, if they've done it 4 times, they could have easily done it plenty more times. They had a very well thought out modus operandi, which points to me, which for me points to them knowing about, you know, homosexual men or gay men, how they operate, how to pick them up, what line to use, like have you got a match is actually used in 1888. So they know about, so even if they're not gay, if they're not homosexual, they know a lot about how these things work. And, you know, these are lads who basically socialize on the street. You know, it's a cheap place to hang out. And so they're standing around on street corners until late at night, outside theatres, outside night markets, etc., in central Melbourne. They see what goes on in the city, and they're very aware of everything that's going on around them.
There's one of the things that fascinated me, Wayne, about the book is that some of those spaces that you referred to, I mean, a lot of that South Melbourne area has been absolutely transformed. But when I was a lad, one of the first places I got picked up by someone was outside Young and Jackson's. You know, Irvine goes to the Carlton Gardens where I had sex. Often had sex first as a young man and then as a student. And I know about your, you know, thinking about your previous book. Clearly there's always been those sexual spaces for men who desire to have sex with other men, but were there spaces that were more than homosocial, that were actually in the bohemian world in Melbourne? That have you discovered that? Is that part of our history?
I'd love to be able to say yes, but there's very little evidence for it. A lot of the evidence that we have comes from criminal trial prosecutions, etc. So basically, by their very nature, it's a liaison that went wrong because you were caught. But that's, you know, someone might be caught once, but that means that you know, that's the tip of the iceberg. You know, it's obviously there's lots of people doing exactly the same thing in the same place who never got caught. So, you know, that's evidence that something happened in a particular place, and quite likely happened a lot in that particular place. But you know, there's no record of there's no record of private parties, of pubs, of cafes or coffee shops, etc. in the 19th century because nobody got caught. If they existed, they were very successful places. So yeah, I'd like to say yes. I'm sure there were. If you look into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there were discrete pubs where people would be tolerated as long as they didn't make too much fuss. There were coffee shops, there were cafes where people could gather discreetly. And I would like to think, and I've got records of that sort of thing happening, even during World War I. So backtracking it 20, 30 years, I'd love to think that, yes, there were spaces that people could use, but, fortunately for the people involved, they never got caught. Unfortunately for me, there's no evidence. So,
it's the thing of, and I know you're a historian, Wayne, and that's, I know, I love history, and but I'm going to ask you a question that comes from my being a fiction writer. So you have spent all these years with Irvine, right? And I know historians balk at this, at counterfactuals or on creating stories that doesn't have the evidence there. But because you've spent this time with him, what would you like to imagine happened to him?
Oh, well, what I think happened is...
That's the historian's answer.
That's a historian's answer.
Which is fine.
Yeah. But, it's quite likely. Well, look, I think, he wanted to disappear, obviously. So he did disappear, which you could do quite easily at the time. Go somewhere else, not be on a shipping list or whatever, choose a new name, start up a new life. And I think he went, I think he left Australia. He went overseas. And in the late 19th century, as a white English citizen, the world's basically your oyster. You've got South Africa, the west coast of the US, you've got Europe, all of Europe. He went somewhere else, and I hope he had, I hope he had a good life, and I hope he found happiness. That's what I hope happened. That's what I wish happened. And if you wanted to, if you were going to do a fictional take on his life and what happened afterwards, that's what I'd say. I'd like a happy ending, please.
I would definitely want a happy ending for him. I guess for me, it's been a bit of a gift, your book, because I've been thinking for a long time about writing something set in that period and not being, I said to Wayne when we were talking a few days ago that I've always been fascinated about taking Scudder, who's the working class man from Morris, and writing his story and bringing him to Australia. And you've kind of given me a way of thinking about that. And you've also made me, really think about how we are so distant from time temporally and in our consciousness from that past. How do you make those people come alive without making them 21st century, which is, as I said, I always think is a mistake. And you've had me start asking, questions that have never gone, but I haven't thought about them as sharply as I have since reading your book. And I've got a question. Because class is so important in the story, even in a subtextual sense, because it even that first encounter, the sex that Irvine has is refracted through class and what class does, right?
Yeah.
How do you think does that still shape our sexuality? Is that because that's, or is it? Yeah. I'm fascinated as an historian and as a man who thinks about these things. What you would say to that?
It's possible that it does, but not to the extent that it did for Irvine, the Larrikins and Ernest Smith, and people in the late 19th century. I don't, well, it's possible class plays a part, but I think people's personal backgrounds these days play as great a role, and people's personal experiences and the experiences that you have, the history that you hold yourself, shapes the person that you are, I think, today, much more than class does. Whereas in the 19th century, class was overwhelming. You know, it was almost impossible to transcend and move out of your class.
Did that surprise you in the research?
How so?
How overwhelming it was as a as a constraint and as a.
Oh, I think I've always known it, because you know I've been paddling around in the 19th century for a very long time, and I've always known that class was a very strong thing. And as I say, when I say it was almost impossible to transcend the class into which you were born, or to move out of the class in which you were born. That works both ways. A working class person would find it almost impossible to move up. And even if, they struck it rich on the Victorian goldfields or became a wealthy industrialist and had lots of money, they were perceived as being not middle class or upper class. They were always just a working class person made good. But it was very difficult to do that. Conversely, a middle class person or an upper class person who was on the downward slope would always be seen as a broken down toff, but not a working class person. And so I think people really were stuck in the class where they started off. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess that's the let's call it a fantasy of imagining Irvine disappearing. Is it possible to is he going to enter a world that is so outside what he's experienced before? And I guess if I was going to write it, I would want to write that story. I'm very aware of I've taken up a lot of the time, but I've got a lot more questions here that I would love to ask you, Wayne. I am really grateful for this book, and it's wonderful. And as I said, it's really hard to make the past come alive, and you did that. And I've got a real sense I've got my sense of John Irvine. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Christos.
I'd like to open it up. Let's open it up to questions from
people. That would be fantastic. Thank you both for that very, very interesting conversation. Amazing questions and really frank and interesting answers, both on the historical perspectives that Wayne you brought to John Irving's life, and Christos on how fictional inspirations can get inspired by works like this. So thank you very much. And yes, as Christos said, we'd like to open up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please put chat in there. We have first question is coming from Dimitri. Thank you very much, Dimitri.
Wayne, thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
I was wondering, as I was listening to you talk, at what stage in your research process did you go, this book has to be written? What was the point at which you go, I've got to capture this man's life on the page, and why?
Fairly early on, I have to say, when I actually found, because as I said, I found the 1888 case first, and then I found the 1897 case. And the thing I love research. I just love research, and so
you can tell.
Yeah, lots of people do. Lots of anyone who's a historian here is in the room tonight knows what I'm talking about. So, you know, I will happily go off down wormholes looking for all sorts of, you know, just really strange little things. But with Irvine, it wrote itself. It just came together so perfectly. I mean, and it was really when I saw that second case, I thought, okay, you know, to paraphrase Lady Bracknell, you know, once could be seen as a misfortune, twice, you know, begins to look like carelessness, or actually, you know, put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4. And I thought, it was when I found that second case, I thought, hang on, you know, once is, you know, unfortunate, twice is, that's a trend. I'm onto someone with a story here, and that's when I really started thinking about telling the story.
Right. Thank you.
No worries.
That's lovely. Thank you, Dimitri. Our next question comes from Paul. Thank you, Paul.
That's me, is it? This Paul, okay. What I was wondering, ooh, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
What I was wondering was there like a police investigation on the disappearance of Irvine? You know, he's a prominent man and suddenly he's not there anymore. Was there an investigation? I'll read the book and find out, but okay.
No, there wasn't. There wasn't. And it was, and that's another thing that makes me think he wanted to disappear. You know, he nothing, we're not talking foul play or anything here. You know, he was last seen in company with 2 of his brothers and their wives at the Lady Mayoress's afternoon reception in Launceston. So he was still talking to his family. He was still invited to, you know, social events in Launceston. And then he disappeared. And the fact that the family didn't raise it as an issue, you know, maybe the family knew where he was, but I have no evidence. You know, one of the things that I did when I was actually doing this research was I actually even got a trip to Germany in, remember that, international travel? I went to Germany because his sister died in Wiesbaden in Germany in 1902. And I thought, well, hang on, he's disappeared 5 years ago. Wouldn't it be great if he actually ended up in Germany? You know, visiting his sister at this lovely spa town, I have to say, because I went and spent a week there and it was lovely. But no, he wasn't there. But correspondence with his sister and the family that she married into is held by University of Melbourne Archives because they were BHP directors. And he's not mentioned. His mother kept a scrapbook of family doings. It's held in the Launceston Public Library, and he just disappears from his mother's scrapbook. Interestingly enough, there are articles, newspaper articles, raised out of the scrapbook, and I've no idea whether they refer to him or not. But no, the family didn't raise any concerns about him disappearing, so the police never got involved.
I wonder if the story is that he was paid off by the family to go somewhere and never be seen again. I mean, that to me
Possibly.
would be why you might never record him in the family from then on.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yes, he could have ended up as a remittance man.
A remittance man, yeah.
Somewhere else, yeah. Quite, very possible, very possible.
There's always a chance that some of a descendant will get in contact with you, Wayne. You may.
Yes.
That would be fascinating. You know, that would be interesting if
that would
someone has a story about a great uncle that.
Yes.
Yes, that could be one of the great outcomes of this book, to have a follow-up volume.
That's
Wayne.
it, volume 2.
Okay. Paul, thank you for that question. We have another question coming from Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, hi there. I guess my question follows on from what Paul said. What's the likelihood that it was an honour killing, that his family killed him and buried him? I don't know about honour killings in upper class Australian. I don't know whether it's a thing related to us.
That's a very interesting theory, which I had not thought of at all.
I can thank my mother for it. That was her first, that was actually her first thought. So, you know, because he just sort of disappears.
It'd be hard to kill.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I hadn't thought of that, Mark, and I don't know, I can't see it. The sort of family they were are very much the sort to sort of just ignore stuff. You know, if it's unpleasant, just, you know, ignore it. You know, oh, look, isn't the weather strange today? And just change the subject.
There's quite powerful matriarchs there, Wayne.
True. His mother is an interesting character. So
yeah, I just thought that last meal that he had was very forced, and it was published in the paper, and it seemed very much that it was, yep, he's all good, nothing to see here, almost like an alibi, and they slipped him a bit of poison or something, but you know, and quickly got rid of him. But you know, that's probably Christos. That's probably my mum's over-imagine, but that was her first thought was, is it an honour killing? So, well,
I mean, I think she should write that book.
yeah. Someone should write that book.
And interestingly, I'm actually a descendant of the Lett family. So his eldest brother marries a Lett from that region. So that was an interesting. So I went back through my family tree and found the Lett connection. So that was a interesting surprise, knowing nothing about him and not expecting that at all. So yeah, really interesting.
Fantastic.
I love that. I think the family connections down the generations is going to bring up some more research for you, Wayne. I
hope so.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is coming from Craig. Thanks, Craig.
Hi there, Wayne, thanks very much. That was a really, really great talk, a really interesting book. I'm looking forward to seeing it arrive in the post. The question I have as someone who works in both fiction and non-fiction is what do you do with those bits in between? Those bits when you're hunting around, you're going through Trove the archive, you're finding lots of great material, lots of facts you're working with, but a lot of things, they're gaps. What do you do with the gaps? And some of those gaps not completely empty. There's a little bit of conjecture, a little bit of thing. How do you address those?
I was very fortunate with Irvine because, as I said, beautifully documented life, basically following week by week for, you know, since he started work up to the time he disappeared. And there were enough, and even if there were gaps, there were enough things there. Yeah, he went to Sydney for 6 months. He got transferred by the bank to Sydney for 6 months. And it's the first time in his adult life he didn't actually appear in the newspaper frequently and regularly. And it's probably because, you know, Sydney's a big town and he has no connections there. So I did have to conjecture, you know, what would he have done in Sydney? But he'd been there before. He would have known people. He was working for the bank, etc. So I was very fortunate in Irvine that, you know, it is such a beautifully documented life. I fortunately had very few gaps. I think if you are faced with writing a life that has gaps, you draw on the evidence that you've got, you can conjecture, but perhaps you just have to actually present it in a more episodic way be honest that, you know, as a historian, you'd be honest. I have no evidence for what happened here or then, but I can conjecture, or, you know, we'll pass over to whatever happened next.
Because as you pointed out, in some histories like this, there's a lot of code you have to understand. If you don't understand the code, you may interpret it very wrongly. And sometimes
that's very true.
Two different interpretations. You have to know which one you're going.
That's very true. That's very true. And even the language particularly, late 19th century language. And I can tell a little story about a word that completely confused me. One of the victims who was attacked by the larrikins reported that, the larrikin actually reported that this bloke had attacked him, had groped him and said that he'd like to bottle him. And I thought, what is this bottle? Bottle is a verb. What does that mean? Is it to glass someone with a broken bottle, or is it, and it wasn't until I was actually purely by accident, after I'd written the book and I put a little note in to say, basically, I don't know what this means. I actually found an old dictionary of criminal slang, and bottle means arse. It's rhyming slang for bottle and glass. So to bottle someone, therefore, is to have anal sex with them. And, if I hadn't serendipitously fell over that reference, there's a 19th century term that I would have escaped me completely. And yeah, so when you're doing this sort of research, you're up against, not just, well, there's code words that you don't get, there's language that you don't get. There are words that have changed their meaning, and also too, as Christos says, you've got to put your mind, and it's almost impossible to do it, but you've got to put yourself into the mind of a 19th century person, and see the world as, or try to see the world as they perceived it, and that's a real challenge.
Sure, and I'll never tell anyone I'm popping down the bottle-o again in the summer.
That's gold. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Gary.
Hi, Wayne.
Hi, Gary.
Wayne, I wonder if I know you found it hard to track the other participants in Irvine's story. Does that include Ernest Smith, the chap Irvine apparently mistook for a sex worker in 1897?
Yes, unfortunately, Smith. Right. Smith is not a name that if ever you're doing research and you find someone called Smith, you just groan. It's such a common name. No, Smith had formed. He'd actually served time 12 months before meeting Irvine in a burglary case. He was actually done for perjury in giving evidence in a burglary case. So he had a criminal record. He wasn't convicted as part of the 1897 case, obviously. He was the victim. But he had a criminal record. He had a prison register. So I was able to check his prison register. And of course, just one offence in 1896, 1 3-month sentence in 1896, and never hit the Victorian criminal system after that. And, again, what happened to a boy called Ernest Smith after 1897 is really, would be difficult to find out.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I'm just interested in his claim to have been heavied by larrikins, and I think he actually named one of them, someone called Tip, not to testify against Irvine. I wonder if, in fact, that may have been truthful.
I wondered about that when I read it myself. Smith comes up with this wild story that he was threatened not to testify against Irvine. He was, he was threatened with violence. He was forced to sign a paper, but he didn't know what the paper said. So, his rather wild story was dismissed by the court when they came to court. He's a working class boy with a criminal background who's telling wild stories about being threatened by a gang that had been put onto him by Irvine. But I did wonder, did Irvine have connections with, youth, larrikin gangs, youth gangs, other rent boys that he'd used previously? It was a really interesting little part of Smith's evidence that I couldn't follow up. I just there was nothing to it. But Christos, if you want to do some fictional stuff, there's an interesting little aside there that could be developed into something.
I mean, that is one of the gap. that was a really interesting comment about the gaps and how the choices you have to make as an historian and the choices you make as a fiction writer. And I think there's responsibilities that, you know, it's not either or, you know, but as a fiction writer, that becomes really fascinating. That sense that there is more to the story of Irvine's involvement in this world. And, you know, because we're all fascinated by how subcultures work. If we, you know, and the sense that there is more to the story is really prominent. It's a temptation. It's really
yeah.
But you still, I mean, there's still a responsibility, I feel, as a fiction writer to, one, not ridicule real lives, right? To not, you know, to try and have an integrity about representing them there. And that thing, I'll just keep repeating it, that if you're going to do it with your language, with the story you tell, with the inner consciousness you put on the page, that they are not us.
Yeah,
I think that's you know, that's a huge. Then I think it's dead. Literally, you're not, you know, you're not telling, you're not making history live.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the boundaries can shift when we start looking at the parts of someone's life that we know and the bits that we don't. Thank you, Gary. Our next question is from Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Wayne. I've got a question. I think there's a part in which he's discussing the Bendigo or Ballarat press as being arrogant and bombastic. And I just wondered if that was just regional bitchiness, or perhaps there was some more knowing sort of criticism of his sexuality in that particular case.
Yeah, interesting. It was Bendigo, and he really made some enemies in Bendigo. And I think it was more about, you know, he potentially took the credit for some stuff that people thought he shouldn't have taken credit for. He flew a little bit too high in some of the events that he had the rowing club put on. And when they didn't quite work out the way they should have worked out, you know, that was seen as egg on his face, and his enemies sort of, you know, well, you know, serve him right. I think he did rub up the wrong way in Bendigo. I don't think it was necessarily anything to do with his sexuality. There's no, in the press reports, there's nothing there that you could actually even begin to think, you know, this is a bit of a gay slur, for want of a better term. Yeah, I think it's very much he was overly confident, and a few people got their noses out of joint. And also too, I mean, I think even in Bendigo in the 1880s, it was, you know, I live in Bendigo now. I've been here 10 years. I know I'll never be a local. There are people here who, you know, whose families have been here since the 1850s. And even in the 1880s, you know, there are people who've been there since day one. And, you know, this young bank Johnny blows into town and sort of takes over lots of things. And I think people got their noses out of joint. So, yeah.
And he's a handsome man.
Small town politics.
Small town.
Absolutely. We have, I think, our last question comes again from Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having 2 bites at the apple. Refresh my memory as to the date when Irvine disappears. What year?
It's 1898.
Okay.
November.
So here's my question. If Wiki tells me correctly, Oscar Wilde's trial was 1895. And I'm kind of wondering what the context of the discussion of the Wilde trial was in Australia, and whether there's some kind of conjecture about how that might have impacted on how the family may have done him in or kicked him out.
Paid him off, yeah. That is interesting. That is, you know, it's an interesting question. The Wilde trial was fairly heavily reported in Australia. And afterwards, Oscar becomes the code word, the derogatory code word for a gay man, the Oscar Wildes of Sydney, etc.
But does it become a slur, Oscar?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I know that.
Right up until World War One, for the next 20 years, to call someone an Oscar, is a fairly derogatory thing. It took over from 1870. Bolton and Park, which was a famous gay scandal in London in the 1870s, also very widely reported in the Australian press. Bolton and Park were the code words for the 1870s, 1880s, and then Wilde takes over from there. So, it would be interesting to know how the family reacted to the Wilde trial, and then John's run-in with the police, John's second run-in with the police. Again, no evidence, but it's a very interesting thought, because life did change after 1895 with the Wilde trial. People's perceptions of homosexuality, effeminacy changed, and a lot of people were still very naive about things, but a lot of people were starting to wake up and see what was, put two and two together.
Yeah, I agree with you, Wayne. Paul's brought up a really interesting sort of way of internationalizing Irvine's story a bit, and it is fascinating to think what even the Launceston Society and press, how they would have made of it with Irvine being there. So it's a really interesting, another way to get into the ending of this story.
Am I wrong? Did he in one of the amateur theatre shows? Did he do Wilde? Is that right?
No,
it wasn't.
No.
Okay.
He was pre-Wilde. His acting days were the 1860s.
Right. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. Well, look, it brings us to the end of our question time here, and I'm going to throw back to my colleague Graham for some final words.
Hi. Yes, thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed that a lot. Having lived with the book from this, the early conversations through the actual production and stuff, there's still so much there, and you get somebody who, who's read it but is outside that process, and you get a really strong feel for what's great about the book, why it really works. In case you're, worried about should I buy the book, because I've heard it all. No, on the contrary, get yourself onto the chat thing and order your book. It's, as I said, $30 instead of $35 from NIBS, supporting a good cause, both NIBS and us. And there's all sorts of stuff in there that we haven't touched on, not just the gaps, but all some of the content. So, if you want to know how much it meant to offer a rent boy in 1897, this will tell you, which is convenient if you fall through a gap in time space. Also,
I did a conversion value on that one into current values, Graham.
Yep.
$36.
Wow. Over the days. It's also, we discovered, I think we might have discovered this after the book was published, it's the very first use of the word pufta in print, so in a court case. So we were talking about the kind of language, the names that these young, particularly the larrikins, would use in relation to people like Irvine. All of the old language, maybe sodomite and stuff, but none of the new language is there yet. But they're using pufta. People said he was a pufta. Many of you all know what that means. So it's a book about Melbourne. It's also about the subculture. It's also about the sexual subcultures.
Yes, I would love to do a walking tour with you, Wayne, one day.
Yeah.
Of the mystery of the handsome man. That would be a fun thing to do.
It struck me that the opening is September 1897, and in a happier world, we might have met there in September on the anniversary and had drinks and probably passing strangers. So thank you both. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Queer Oz Folk has plans for the future. We're about to produce our second book. You can support us by obviously buying this book, promoting the project, and we will be having probably in Zoom again, future launches. Back to you, Lisa.
Yes, again, my thanks for everyone coming today. Particular thanks to Christos and Wayne, and thanks to our hosts, NIBS and the Search Foundation. We love you lots. Thank you very much,
Indeed.
and everyone, please buy the book. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye,
much,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you for
Bye.
coming. Thank you for speaking.
Great.
Thank you.
Great presentation.